Hello and welcome to In Conversation With. In this episode, we got a chance to catch up with team principal and CEO of Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team, Toto Wolff. Toto, brilliant to speak to you. How are you keeping?
Good to see you, Danny. I'm keeping well. It was a period of adjustment that was necessary to kind of get your head around. That is something we have never experienced before. But lots of learning, I would say.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to the adjustments and how you're sort of coping mentally a little bit later on. But one of the things that's come up through this In Conversation With series has been where people's passion started for motor racing and how that sort of roots of energy began. And I wanted to talk to yourself about that and when your sort of first memories of motor racing.
My first memories of motor racing actually go back to the early 90s when a friend of mine competed in Formula 3. And we visited him on the Nürburgring, and I remember looking at the race and thinking of myself, this is exactly what I would like to do. And it was the moment where it ignited my passion.
I was going to ask you about that because I think you were 17 odd when you were there at the Nürburgring. What was it about the day? Was it the noise? Was it the speed? What was it that sort of galvanized you towards motorsports?
It was the gladiatorial perspective I had on the drivers. They were riding those machines, or driving those machines, and it was a rainy, typical Nürburgring weekend, and their skills in managing a car that was against all physical laws was something that I admired. It was a skill that I didn't have and that I wanted to learn.
It's interesting because I wondered whether, you say that was your sort of first memory of motor racing, but I wondered as an Austrian growing up in the 80s, whether, we saw Gerhard Berger emerging onto the scene, Nicky clinching his third world championship, whether there was that culture in Austria that sort of had something to do with it, but it was just the moment of track that sort of drew you towards motor racing.
Yes, absolutely. I remember seeing Nicky and Gerhard obviously on TV, but I never followed Formula One any closely. I don't recall me looking or watching any Grand Prix. It really was visiting the track and seeing it in front of me that started it all.
I want to talk a bit about your racing career and part of it in terms of enjoyment, because I think for those who've seen you interviewed before or even seen you at the podium, we see a sort of brief moment of Toto Wolff celebration, and then very, very quickly it's on to the next challenge and the next hurdle to jump or mountain to climb. And I just wondered, during your motor racing career, were you ever able to enjoy it, or were you always looking for that improvement and that next step?
No, I was much more able to enjoy when I was racing myself, because the moments are very intense if you drive the car yourself. The pain of losing and the joy of winning are something that are just overwhelming racing cars. And I remember those unbelievable moments where overcoming adversity, being resilient and being able to come out on top was something that was indeed extremely special.
It was a question I was going to ask you a bit later, actually, but you mentioned before about this kind of period of adjustment we're all in at the moment, and you talk there about that overwhelming feeling. And I think for someone who's so competitive, I just wonder how you fill the void. Is Jack at home getting consistently thrashed at snap, or what are you doing as an outlet for that competitive nature?
I think what Corona taught me and Susie is that slowing down can actually be something that is pretty enjoyable. At the beginning, it was very difficult to adapt, and we packed our days with activities that were allowed and tried to keep ourselves busy in the gym, working out, going for a run or a bike ride once it opened up, and then obviously Formula One still being very present. But since a few weeks, we have readjusted. I found some time for reflection, time to actually enjoy enjoy the moments with Jack, who's 3 years old, and my elder children, Benedict and Rosie, and we've been outdoors a lot, lucky with the weather in Europe. And for me personally, a new experience. It was 25 years since I started working, and I don't remember one single period where I would be in the same place more than 2 weeks for a holiday. And here we go. It's changed our lives, and I think for the better.
It's interesting you say that, Toto, because we obviously spoke earlier this year, you and I, and you were talking about the fact that when you have ever had vacation and holiday time, that initially it's good, but then your mood can sort of drop off a little bit as you get a bit bored. And you found you've kind of been through that phase and come back to finding sort of a place of wellness, I guess.
Yeah, we still need to be considered, because this virus is still making many lives very, very bad. Either you are affected yourself or somebody in your family, or we are privileged to be in an environment, I'm in Austria now, where you can actually move outside. So let's not have the joy run away with us. It's still a serious situation. I kind of, like you said, dive through the moment of what are we going to do next. And it's a little bit like somebody who moves onto an island and is being depressed for the first 3 weeks and then suddenly finds the bliss. And I have started to enjoy the days with less planning, with less meetings, with less phone calls, and it's something that an experience that has made me grow as a human being.
I want to come on to that in a moment. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, when you first stepped away from motor racing and you started March 15 and your investment business, I've heard interviews with you before where you talked about coming in as an investor first to HWA in motor racing and then of course into Formula One with Williams, and it was just an investment. And I just wonder, was it really just an investment, Toto, or was this a grand master plan to one day become team principal at Mercedes, and you'd worked all this out over a period of 10 years?
No, when I quit racing at a very young age, I didn't do anything for 10 years. For me, it's either all or nothing. And only 10 years later, I kind of rediscovered a little bit of rallying and GT driving for me as a hobby. And the finance business investments was always what I did as a living. The rest was a weekend activity from time to time. And then eventually investment opportunities opened up in the motor racing environment. First the rally team, and then it was Williams, and eventually this big opportunity with Mercedes came to being an executive, which I wasn't before ever. And here we go, 8 years down the road. That's what I have been doing, and it's amazing.
It's just incredible to think that saying yes to opportunities has ended you where you are today, and of course us speaking now. Let's talk about the first time we meet people. Those first meetings are always sort of stick with us, and of course when you were doing investments, you also became involved in a bit of driver management. Which one of your reflections of first meeting our two drivers, and just to start off, the first time, if you remember, the first time you met Valtteri?
Yes, obviously, when the investment side kicked off in motor racing, I got more involved, and I in a way, I tried to give back to young drivers which I lacked, and that was financing and guidance. And one day, I got called by a friend who runs a Formula Renault team in Germany, Timo, and he said to me, there is this exceptional boy that is racing for a under-financed Finnish private team, and he's very much at the front of the grid, and I'm going to take him for next year. He hasn't got any manager. And I said, no, thank you very much. I made some bad experiences with some drivers that were grateful when they were lacking support, and world champions in forgetting once they got started to earn money. And I said, I don't want to do this. And he said, fair enough. And a few months later, he called me and said, I just wanted to tell you that Valtteri won his first 2 Formula Renault races in Oschersleben in Germany. And I said, well, that was expected. Didn't you say that? And he said, yeah, but he won it the first race with 27 seconds to second place, and the second race with 24 seconds. Okay, that's unusual. And then Valtteri called up and said, "Can I meet you?" And we met, and he walked into the office and said, "I'm actually not interested in looking out for a manager. I just want your advice, because there are few groups that are interested in supporting me, and I just like to hear your opinion." And I gave him my honest opinion. And at the end, we ended up 4 investors, a friend of mine, Willi, and Mika Hakkinen and Didier Couton, to help Valtteri with his career. And that was I believe, in 2008.
That's amazing, really, because Valtteri as well must have been such a young guy at that time. He's sometimes gently spoken, Valtteri, but he can be a bit of a surprise package. It's quite a big thing to do as a young man in 2008 to come and sit down and have that meeting, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, he came alone. He wasn't with any parent. It was snowing outside, and he wore just a pullover. And it was, in a way, like he is fierce, competitive, resilient. And there is this shell of the quiet, nice Finnish guy, but there is a very stubborn, strong competitor underneath.
Yeah, that's my favourite side of Valtteri. And then Lewis, of course. It's a bit of a trick question, this, and I'll come on to it, the reason why, in a moment. But do you remember the first time you met Lewis?
Yes, I remember. It was pre-season testing in Formula 3. He just made the step from Formula Renault into Formula 3, and I was involved. One of my drivers was involved in ART, which was the team to beat back in the day. And I remember visiting my driver in Valencia, and Lewis just walked over to the garage. His team wasn't as competitive as ART was, and he looked at the car. And I remember this young boy being very interested and curious to see what happens in the other garage. That was the first time I saw him, and I believe that must have been probably 2004, but I could be wrong.
Do you know the two of you had raced on the same track on the same weekend in the same paddock prior to that?
No, I didn't know. Which race was that?
2002, Donington Park. Yourself and Philip Peter were racing. You finished 5th in the FIA GT Championship, and a 17-year-old Lewis Hamilton won the Formula Renault 2000 race that weekend with Christian Klein finishing 2nd. So 2002 in October in the UK, you've been racing not alongside each other, but on the same track that day. Just amazing how close you'd come to one another all those years ago.
Yeah, and that race has another importance for me, because on that particular weekend in Donington, I remember hearing about a young girl racing in Formula Renault, being in the front group, having been on the podium, Susie Stoddart. And I thought, that's interesting. It's the first time that I've heard of a girl actually beating the boys on such a competitive level of racing. I don't know if you have the results, whether you can see where she's ended up that weekend, but I remember hearing the name.
Yeah, I've got them, but they're all handwritten in a program from 2002, so it'll take me a while to go through, but I'll let you know afterwards once we wrap this up. But that's amazing. Yeah, I imagine that was more important over that weekend.
I met so I heard about my wife for the first time this particular weekend, and I got very close to the driver who would be a part of my journey.
Amazing. Just a weekend, probably a rainy weekend, I imagine, in Donington in October. Talking of the two drivers, I just wonder, because different people are doing different things at the minute. I wonder, have you spoken to the drivers much over this period of time? How's that communication been? Because I think as fans, we're all desperate to hear what's going on. I just wonder whether the drivers are ringing you up every other day asking when they can get back in the car, or whether you're giving them a bit of space to do their training and reset before we get going again.
I very much leave it to the drivers to, when there's nothing urgent, I leave it to them to manage the communication. And we haven't spoken to Valtteri. I think he's in a good place personally, and I'm happy about that. And with Lewis, I've been very much in contact. We've spoken regularly, we've WhatsApped very often, keeping each other up to date.
So you're not worried about if we don't get racing soon, we might lose Valtteri to the Tour de France and Team Ineos over there if we're not careful.
Yeah, he's an endurance guy, and I think he has now the right partner for cycling. I think making the step into pro cycling is still a different beast. But I'm sure he's having fierce competitions with his girlfriend in the same way that I have with Susie in a go-kart track.
One of the things I want to talk about, I think as fans we find fascinating, is the driver market, because we hear a sort of lot of gossip about it, I suppose, but I don't think we really understand how, as team principal, you go about driver selection, whether it's based on, or how much is based on data and numbers, how much is on gut feeling and who you think will fit into a team, whether it's results driven. I'm just interested how, as a team principal and as a team, you analyse drivers.
There is a data side of things. You look at race results, back into the junior formulas. You look at comparison with teammates, and how these teammates then compared to other people. And then there is the personality side that's very important. How would the driver fit into the team structure? How would be the dynamic with his teammate? Who could be the teammate? What's the planning for the future? And all these factors are being, in a way, compounded, and then we are discussing that in a forum, and everybody gives his opinion, and most often everybody within that group has the same opinion anyway.
We're in a new era, and of course we're starting to hear from different countries some relaxation of social distancing, and therefore an opportunity to go back to work. And I think for all of us, we're excited for sport to come back on TV, and ultimately in Formula One for us to go back racing. But it'll be different, social distancing and safety at the factory. How are you working on that at the moment? What steps are being put in place to make sure we can be effective, efficient and fast, but obviously most importantly doing so safely?
We have a great task force in MGP who is structuring the life after Corona, with the social distancing, moving desks and workstations and workplaces around. So it will be very different. I think what we have learned is that you can do a lot from home. These Zoom conferences or Skype or WebEx are very efficient. So I think that's going to change in our work environment. And then, of course, it's about planning the next races and hopefully getting the season started soon. I'm pretty optimistic that we can start in Austria, because Austria has been one of the best countries in keeping the virus numbers low, and I think they will come up with a plan how we can race.
Let's talk about Austria. It's of course your country, your home country, of course, but more than that, it's a track that you know very, very well. So let's just talk a little bit about that and how much you're relishing the challenge of going back racing in Austria, and how well you do know the circuit.
I know the circuit extremely well because I did 1,000 laps there as a racing driver and as an instructor. I lived in Spielberg whilst being a junior driver, and it feels a little bit like a second home. I love Styria and many fond memories from the place. Starting the season there makes me very proud that Austria will be the season opener, and doing it on 2 consecutive weekends. So finally we get 2 races done, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
As I mentioned earlier, I think for all of us as sports fans, we just cannot wait to see you guys back out there racing once more. Toto, thank you so much for this time. Hopefully the next time we speak, we'll know when we're going racing again. We can have some fun out on track. Thank you, Toto Wolff.
Thank you. Bye.